You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with the political journalist for the Financial Times, Jasmine Cameron-Chileshe, and the Scottish Daily Mail's deputy political editor, Rachel Watson. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The Metro suggests that the Omicron variant of COVID may have peaked in the UK as case numbers have fallen for 5 days in a row. The Chancellor is in favour of reducing the self-isolation period from 7 to 5 days in a bid to ease staffing shortages across the country. While the Mirror has an investigation into the Conservatives' levelling up agenda, reporting on a crumbling school in Yorkshire with no money for repairs. The Mail pleads with the Prime Minister, save us from a cost of living crisis, Boris. That's also the lead for The Express. The Guardian hears from campaigners who insist the Housing Secretary, Michael Gove's £4 billion plan to upgrade fireproof cladding on high-rise buildings doesn't go far enough. The Financial Times quotes NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg, warning the organisation is prepared for a new armed conflict in Europe if negotiations with Moscow fail and Russia invades Ukraine. And we bet you think this story is about you. The Star finds out that modern men are vainer than women. My female director just said, yep, in my ear. We're joined tonight by Jasmine Cameron-Chileshe and Rachel Watson. We're not going to talk about that story. Let's go straight to the Telegraph and Rishi Sunak throwing his weight behind calls for a 5-day isolation period. Jasmine.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting. So first we had the Education Secretary, and now we're hearing from the Chancellor that there are growing calls within the government to reduce the isolation period down to 5 days. And it really shows there is quite a bit of concern at the impact of COVID-linked staff shortages on the economy. It's not just in hospitals and the NHS, but it's also in train companies also reporting it as well. And I think we're at this really interesting stage in the pandemic where we're hearing reports of hundreds of thousands of cases, but at the same time we've got lots of people getting their booster vaccines. We know that we've got better treatments when it comes to treating people with COVID in hospital, and so it's only natural that ministers are sort of assessing the situation and thinking, what is a proportionate response? What do we need to do now? We're at this stage in the pandemic, and how do we balance the societal harms caused by COVID restrictions alongside the health harms caused by COVID itself? And so I think the Telegraph's reporting that around 60% of those in cabinet are in favour of cutting the self-isolation period. So I think it's probably inevitable that we will see a change on that front.
Yes, and that quote of the 60% of cabinet being in favour, that also stressing that it would have to be sanctioned as safe by scientists before proceeding to that, Rachel.
Yeah, and I think this is another one of those areas that a conversation start this weekend. So around that cut self-isolation to 5 days, that was something that we heard, as we've just heard the Education Secretary and the Chancellor have put their backing behind, but also that note of caution around experts. But again, we heard other kind of measures being tested with the public this weekend, such as the end to free lateral flow testing, for example. Now, that seems like it's not going to happen anytime soon, but it seems like the government is floating this idea that that is where we are headed in the pandemic now. And, yes, these case numbers that we have now are very, very high across the whole of the United Kingdom. But we saw that in Scotland this week as well, where the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, kind of changed her tone a little bit and spoke about how she would look to bring forward a roadmap and framework to dealing with the pandemic that wasn't necessarily the way that's been dealt with now. And I think that seems to be the point we're at, where these measures, like, can we cut self-isolation again? Can we do we need the testing at levels that it's at the moment? Those conversations are just being floated at the moment, not necessarily that they're going to happen this week or next week, but that's where the government is, and that is where they want to get us to the next couple of months.
And the Metro moving even further to suggesting that Omicron is on the way out, with their headline going cron, right, Jasmine?
Yeah, so it's quite an optimistic splash by the Metro. I think they've cited statistics that show daily cases have fallen for 5 days in a row, which is definitely encouraging. But I think at this point in the pandemic, it's slightly too early, I think, to say that we've hit the peak. I'm always cautious of looking at these daily figures. I think we need to look at sort of weekly and monthly figures to get a sense of the trends. But I do think things are hopefully looking up. The Metro cites Plan B and the vaccine booster program as one of the causes of that. But I do think there is definitely a concern about what's happening in hospitals, and one of the government's main priorities throughout the pandemic is making sure the NHS is sort of, doesn't keel over. And we've seen in the past few days, I think it's around at least 20 hospitals have declared critical incidents. There's concern over staff shortages in hospitals and an uptick in hospitalisation. So I think the statistics are encouraging, and I think it's definitely not all doom and gloom, but I think we should still be quite cautious in how we interpret these figures.
Yes, Rachel, do you think this is an irresponsible headline? Because it does suggest that it's all over.
I think there's been a real shift, as I said before, this weekend, and that I think when you're looking at case numbers, we're hearing people and experts talk about how they think this is the peak, that we've reached the peak. So it's difficult for people not to feel positive and have that sense of positivity around it. Today, we heard people talk about the pandemic reaching an endemic stage where we start to learn to live with this virus. And one of the differences, again, with this variant compared to others is we've not seen those hospital numbers reach what they did in previous waves. Now, obviously, there is a caveat. We're not quite at that point that we might expect numbers to peak. There's still a few weeks. And particularly in Scotland, we've been told, it could be the end of the month before we see hospital numbers peak. But it is difficult, although these case numbers are very high. And previously I would have thought we would be in a complete lockdown with numbers this high. In Scotland last week we had one day where cases hit 20,000. In previous waves our highest number was 7,000 a day. So in previous waves of this virus you might have expected to be in a full and complete lockdown at this point, but we're not. We're hearing from the government across the UK that they are looking at ways to move us forward to live with this virus. So, this headline might be a little bit positive. I think, maybe it is going a little bit, they've got excited, it is very positive, but it's difficult to kind of get away from that sense when you have people talking about kind of moving out of restrictions and getting on with life, and having this virus is something to live with rather than something that restricts our daily lives.
Let's move on to reports of the cost of living crisis and the Mail urging the Prime Minister to act. Senior Tories apparently warning him that unless he tackles the cost of living crisis, he will be punished at the polls. Jasmine.
Yeah, so I think there is a growing sense of panic among Conservative backbenchers at the possible impact of this cost of living crisis. So we're expecting in April that national insurance contributions will go up. We know that energy bills are likely to go up as well. There are concerns about inflation. And there is a sense that while Johnson has been criticised for his handling of COVID, for example, for reports of officials having parties during lockdown, there is a sense that all of that sort of pales in comparison to what will happen if people are getting to the end of the month and realising that their pockets are being squeezed, realising that their bills are going up. And actually that there will be a political impact if voters feel as though their lives have essentially got worse under a Conservative government. And Tory MPs are very conscious of that. And they're urging Johnson to essentially reassure the public to put some measures in place that will effectively mean that people aren't seeing their paycheck squeezed.
And Rachel, one senior Conservative saying that, people being upset about the furore over the number 10 parties will pass, but what won't pass is the anger people will feel when, far from being levelled up, they find their standard of living has been levelled down. Yes, and this is what will be concerning those Tory backbenchers the most with this, is that just a few months away we have the local council election. So this could be a very quick test of how the public feel about this. It's only a few months away. We'll see people go to the polls. And there's an interesting quote in there from the chairman of the Education Committee, where he talks about this being the number one issue facing the Prime Minister at the moment, which I do think is the case. I think the cost of living, people are going to see this in their pockets. People are concerned about their energy prices. They're concerned about tax rises, inflation.
And then the quote continues there to say people voted for Boris Johnson because they believed their financial security and prosperity would be better. He has got to make it happen. And I think that's one of the things with Boris Johnson. He came into government making a number of promises to people. People that voted for him believed that he would make their lives better, whether that was through Brexit, for business, or that people would see their standards of living better under his leadership. And if that doesn't happen, if people feel that they're worse off under him, if people feel that they are not getting to where they wanted to be, that's a real concern for Conservatives. And I think they will be looking around and saying, why isn't the government acting? What are you going to do? And you need to put measures in place to ensure that people are not getting to the end of the month and having to make really tough decisions on how they spend their money.
Yes, and that story is also on the front of the Express. PM urged act now on cost of living squeeze. For the moment, Rachel and Jasmine, thank you very much. We are going to take a break. Coming up, a Sky News poll suggests a third of Tories think he should resign. So is the writing on the wall for Boris Johnson? We'll discuss that next. You're watching the press preview. Still with me, Jasmine Cameron-Chileshe and Rachel Watson. Let's take a look at the Metro, and this is actually reporting on a Sky News story. It's a YouGov poll done for us, saying that 1 in 3 Tories say the Prime Minister should resign. Are you shocked by that, Jasmine?
I mean, it's not massively surprising. The past few weeks and months have seen a flurry of negative headlines for Johnson. We've seen his own backbenchers rebel against him. There's been concern about, lockdown breaking parties in Downing Street. There was everything that happened with the Slee scandal. So it has been a bruising couple of months for Johnson. And I do think there is a growing sense that his political capital is slowly running out. He is someone who came into power promising to get Brexit done, promising to level up the country, and instead has had to spend the majority of his premiership dealing with a pandemic. And so as a result, has had to spend billions, has had to break manifesto promises, has had to hike up taxes. And so even among backbenchers, there is a growing sense of unease about what Johnson stands for and how conservatism is shaping up under his leadership. But I mean, I think the poll still suggests that the majority still support Johnson, even though it's quite a damning statistic that 1/3 want to get rid of him. But I do think it's natural at this point. He's a midterm leader. It's natural that people are looking around and thinking about alternatives, but I don't think he's going anywhere anytime soon, although I'm sure there are many within his party who are secretly plotting and planning to find his successor.
Rachel, do you think it's expected that almost half think Chancellor Rishi Sunak would do a better job and take more seats at the next election?
I think it's a really interesting poll, as you say, and I think actually Rishi Sunak is someone who, particularly towards the beginning of the pandemic, was very much in the public light. He was bringing forward furlough. He was getting a lot of praise from a lot of different people about how he was specifically handling the pandemic, and his public appearances seemed to go up. The number of people who know him and the support that he gave through that. So I don't think, as has just been said, I think we are midway through the parliamentary term. It is no great shock given what has happened over the past couple of years, specifically what's happened in the last couple of months, actually, that Tory members might be looking around questioning whether Boris Johnson is the right person to lead them into another election. We know that the Conservatives can be pretty brutal when it comes to winning. They are a party that likes to win, and they like to have someone in place they know can win. And I think that is what they will be looking at as we go into the council elections that I mentioned earlier. When we get to that point, when we see how the Conservatives do across the country, they might start looking around seriously then and thinking, who is this? Is Boris Johnson? Is his political capital enough for us anymore? What promises has he broken, and is he still a winner?
Rachel and Jasmine, thank you very much for taking us through the papers this hour.